All right, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Jason, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I was thinking we probably should have done this in person, but this is a unique time for you to be recording a podcast. First of all, happy birthday. It is your birthday today, right?
Yes, thank you so much. It is my birthday. Yay.
And you're also in where are you? Indianapolis?
I'm in Indianapolis sitting in a hotel room, ready to race a half marathon tomorrow.
Awesome. Well, you've got a lot going on today with your race preparation for tomorrow and your birthday being today. So I appreciate the time you've made for our strength running listeners today. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm really excited for the conversation and I know it's going to be great.
Well, we have pulled together a whole bunch of different training questions from strength running listeners. And we are going to tackle these in no specific order. I think we're going to start with some injury questions first, and then we're going to get into some bigger picture questions about how to design training for the long term. And there's a lot of different flavors of these questions that we're going to get to. So we're going to dive right in and talk first about a very specific question from JD. He's had a couple hamstring strains over the last year, so he's obviously a little bit worried about getting more hamstring strains. So his question is there some indicator, a red flag or something similar during a workout that you're nearing a muscle pull and need to cut the workout short? This is a tricky one because usually muscle pulls are non-existent 1 second, and then a second later your hamstring is in three pieces. So what do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things where, whoop, there it goes. I think it's important to focus in on what's going on before the run. So, a proper warm up, making sure that you're properly warming up into the speed and into the pace. I love running a really nice transition mile. Sometimes it's a 1K before I actually start my workout. It's that pace that's in between easy and it's in between your first rep. Let's say you're running 400. So it's a nice way to really warm up the body and especially focusing in on those dynamic stretches, those dynamic drills or the drills. And as we're going into winter and having just a colder season, I think it's really important to emphasize those stretches and those drills a little bit more, as well as that transition pace. But then I would also focus it on strength training. I think that's going to be a huge piece to making sure that your hammies, your legs, your lower body, your entire body is strong and feeling really good. And it may prevent some of those muscle pulls or some of those little niggles that we have when we're in training.
Yeah, this is definitely a more difficult question because I think the simple answer is no. There's typically not some kind of warning sign that your muscle is about to tear or get a strain. So really the question then comes down to prevention and making sure you're doing everything right before you start running very, very fast so that you're just reducing the risk of getting that kind of an injury from the very beginning. And I think, like you said, doing some kind of a dynamic warm up before you even start running to really prime the body for the act of running is going to be really important. And then, just in general, it's probably more important to do a more thorough warm up the faster your running is going to be. So if you're running a really fast workout or you're getting ready to race, let's say a mile, your warm up should be a lot more comprehensive than if you were about to race a marathon. A lot of coaches would probably not even recommend doing any running before a marathon because on the one hand, you're not ready to run about 27 miles that day. You've only been running probably up to 20 miles. And we want to spare our glycogen or fuel stores before a marathon. That's not really true with a shorter workout or a 5K or a shorter event. And so we can run a couple miles. We can do a series of strides. We can do that dynamic warm up. We can do some form drills. And then as we start the workout, I think your suggestion of doing a slower rep beforehand just to further that warm-up process is a really good one. But, in general, I don't really think that there's some sort of indicator or red flag that you're nearing a muscle pull. Of course, if you are doing sprint workouts, just recognize that a little bit is really all you need. You know, we're distance runners, we're endurance runners. Doing a lot of sprint work, especially if you're running relatively high mileage, is going to be putting that sprint work within the context of high fatigue. And that makes me very nervous. So whenever you're going to be running really fast, let's say anything faster than mile race pace, let's make sure you warm up really, really well and probably keep the volume of that pretty low.
Yeah.
Let's move on to a question about injury prevention, a little more general. You know, I've long said that the number one injury prevention strategy you can implement is just smart training. Let's make sure you're doing intelligent training. And this question from Michael really gets at that. He says, after intelligent training design, what other decisions should be made to keep athletes healthy and progressing? What do you think, Sarah?
Wow, there's so much here. I feel like you can do so much in terms of keeping the athletes healthy and progressing. I feel like first and foremost, you need to have like joy in your training. You need to and should have something that you're really going after and something that makes you excited. And I think that's going to be easier to progress forward when you're excited about it, when it's something that fills your cup and you're excited to get out the door every day or most days, because there are going to be days that we aren't necessarily as motivated. And I think there's so many other things that we can look into in terms of staying healthy. So we can look at our mind and staying healthy on the mindset piece of things. We can stay healthy in terms of making sure that we're getting our sleep and all of the 8 hours that they recommend athletes get per night. Sleep is the number one recovery tool. It also helps us stay healthy and happy. And I think that's a great starting point going into this season.
Yeah, the sleep is going to be a huge issue. I think there was a study showing like if you got less than 6 hours sleep, it increased your injury risk dramatically. I think it was like up to 50%.
I
And look,
believe it.
guys, we're participating in a sport that has a pretty high injury risk by itself, and we should be doing everything in our power to reduce our injury risk. So I'd probably put sleep top three, top five
Yeah.
in terms of a tool to reduce your injury risk. You know, I'm the strength running guy, so I've got to say strength training. You know, I think the science is pretty clear. Both the lived experience of high level runners and coaches and the research behind it as well shows that once you've got your training right, once you are sleeping really well, once you're actually psychologically invested in whatever goal that you're going after, I think that's probably the most important thing for overall progression. Are you in love with the sport? Do you absolutely love what you're doing? Do you have some sort of, you know, big goal that gets you up in the morning? That's what's going to keep you progressing in the long term, even if you make all these mistakes. You know, I've had all the injuries. I don't think I've not had a single type of running injury. You know, actually, there's a couple I haven't had. So let's knock on wood there. But once you have that big goal that motivates you, then it's like, okay, what are the tactics that we can implement on the ground? And I think strength training is arguably one of the most impactful strategies that one can implement to reduce your injury risk, to get stronger, improves your running economy, which is going to help with both your progression in the long term. So strength training would be one of those things that I would call a low risk, high reward training option that is going to give you a lot of benefit, but really doesn't have too many drawbacks. Yes, you can do strength training incorrectly, but I honestly think that incorrect strength training is better than no strength training at all. What do you think? Do you think I'm
I
a little off base with my love letter to strength training there?
No, I actually love that. I'm glad that I was hoping that you would bring up strength training. So I feel like strength training is such a huge component to training and racing well and also staying healthy in the long run that a lot of athletes don't buy into until they have an injury pop up and maybe they're forced a little bit through PT to start working in the gym. And Jason, you're a big believer that it doesn't have to be hours in the gym, right? It can be 20 to 30 minutes a few times a week. And it really does move the needle in fitness. I've seen it as a coach and a lot of athletes who've really embraced that strength training component. Once they kind of get to a level in their training of like the foundation miles are there, they've run, maybe it's a few marathons or a few half marathons, or going after this PR, this goal, like let's get after it. Let's start going into the 1% to really move the needle in that. And strength training is definitely going to be one of them. And it doesn't take long. And once you start to feel the benefits of it, it really is addictive in some sense. And it is something that you continue to see gains from. You can continue to feel the strength on the track and on the road. And it's something that really is a huge needle mover for athletes.
Yeah, it is strange that we almost have to directly experience the benefits for us to start getting on board with strength training. And on the one hand, I get it. We're runners. We don't want to lift weights. I'm sort of in that boat too. I'm someone who would rather go run 10 miles than spend 25 minutes in the weight room, because most of that time is just spent sitting around in between lifts, and I just can't sit still for that long. I'd rather be running around on some dirt road in Boulder with you, Sarah. But if I can't do that, then at least I will do the strength training, because it will then allow me to do more running on the dirt roads with you. So
Yeah.
I recognize it, but I also would love to sort of bottle up those benefits and put it in some beverage that runners could have. So they didn't have to actually do anything that they didn't want to do.
Infuse them with strength and just have it there. I love that. I feel like I started strength training at the beginning of the year. I was going into my second Boston Marathon, and my coach said, we really need to work on strength. You want to run the hills strong. You want to run the Newton Hill strong. You want to have a strong 26.2. You need to get in the gym. And at this point, I'd been running higher mileage. I was going into my fifth marathon, and I was taking reformer Pilates twice a week and adding in one strength training session through the Boston Marathon. We did it on Wednesdays after my workout, after my track workout. It made such a huge difference. And then it was something that I want to continue to add. So then I went into an off season, or not really an off season, maybe an off season for marathoning, but I went into a summer of speed, and I practiced running the mile and the 5K and really honing in on that top end speed. We added a second day of strength training, and I came through the fall in full beast mode. It was incredible. And I could feel the benefits of like how great all that time in the gym was. And if you can really lean into your why and lean into the reason behind going into the gym and getting it done, I think it makes it a little bit easier too.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably have a whole podcast episode only talking about the fact that you focusing on strength and speed is likely going to be a major contributor to breakthroughs in the marathon. It's not this never-ending quest for endurance. You've got to be a more well-rounded athlete. Well, we can
Yeah.
maybe put a pin on that. We'll come back to it another time in the future, Sarah. But let's get to a question on heart rate. This is actually really interesting. This question goes, if heart rate is higher on easy runs right before a race, should that be a concern? It can definitely impact my mental game, which is why I'm asking. And maybe I'll just jump in first here and give a very simple answer. I would just say no. I would say that, look, if you're in the week leading up to a race, you notice that your heart rate is higher than usual on a couple of your easy runs. Look, we could sit here and overanalyze this and absolutely ruin your confidence going into your goal race that's coming up. But why would we do that? At this point, the hay is in the barn. There's really not much one can do to address this high heart rate. There's not even really much time to determine if this is a problem or if this is not a problem. This could be a minor thing. It could be a temporary thing. Who knows? My suggestion is simply maybe you ignore the heart rate on your easy runs right now. Maybe you get a little bit more sleep leading up to your goal race if you can. Maybe try to counteract any sort of fatigue or need for extra recovery. and then just try to run the race to the best of your ability, not thinking about this high heart rate during your easy runs at all. So I'm a little bit like an ostrich with this question. I want to stick my head in the sand. I want to ignore it a little bit because there's not much really we can do. I would have a different answer if this was in the middle of the training cycle, but I'm curious how you would deal with this.
Yeah, definitely. If it's happening on race week, let's build this athlete up and say, forget about the data, right? It could mean that maybe this athlete, because they are in taper, it's race week, they have to shift some things in their personal life around to accommodate for travel or for race weekend. Maybe they're running at a different time of the day. Maybe they forgot their heart rate monitor and they're using their wrist heart rate, right? Maybe it's race week nerves, right? We all have that, and I feel like that can kind of impact it. And if you are a little bit more hypersensitive to the data, I think too, maybe it's one run, it's your first run, and the heart rate is a little bit higher, and then that's all you're thinking about on runs 2 and 3 of that week. Chances are, if you're over focusing on the heart rate, it's probably going to be a little bit higher anyways, just because you're focusing in on it. So what I love to share with athletes on race week is, let's get back to your goal for the race. Let's visualize what you want to create, what you want to run, and really just hone in on that. And I think everything else will fall into place because, Jason, you're right. The hay is in the barn. It's race week. It's time to celebrate on race morning.
Yeah, this is probably a great point to say, like, this is where the value of a coach can be really impactful, because I think if you don't have someone almost talking you off the ledge a little bit, then you might stay up there on the ledge and really, kind of hurt your psychology going into the race. And I'm someone who believes that racing is like 99% mental. You could be in the best shape of your life, but if you don't have the mental toughness, the confidence, the drive, and really the willingness to experience some discomfort on race day, you're never really going to achieve very much. And being so lost in the data is probably not a good thing for your mindset going into a big goal race. So there's a time and a place to really pour over that data. I don't think a couple days before your goal race is that time, because at this point, like you said, it's the time to be talked up. It's the time to almost ignorantly tell yourself that you are about to qualify for the Olympic trials. You are about to have a breakthrough. And I think that kind of cheerleading for yourself has its place in the days leading up to a big goal race.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about warm-ups. When you're talking to your athletes, Sarah, do you have a different philosophy on how you warm up for a run, if it's an easy run or a long run versus a very short run? Maybe you're going to the track and you're doing a set of hard intervals, or even if you're getting ready for, say, a short race like a 5K.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel like all of those types of runs or styles of runs require a different warm up, right? So if we're going out for, let's say it's a 5 mile easy run, there's a great run in Wash Park on Tuesday nights at 6 o'clock. Jason, you've been there. And, we'll warm up with leg swings. We'll keep it light. We'll keep it easy. And then we'll start that first mile a little bit slower than maybe what our intended or average pace is going to be for that 5 miles, right? Just nice and easy warm up into that first mile along with those leg swings. I think the same can be true for the long run. If you're going into a long run with quality, or a long run that does have some race pace in it, maybe it's marathon pace, there can be a time and place where you stop after your easy miles, and before you go in to your marathon pace miles, you do the dynamic stretches, the drills, and maybe a few strides. My coach had me do that last week before my long run that had a 5-5-5-5, 5 moderate, 5 at marathon pace, and repeat. And it really did help getting into a faster pace a little bit easier. So that's a great way in the long run to kind of warm up. But when you're going into the track and you have, let's say you are training for a 5K and you have a very speedy track workout, I really love the leg swings, the hip openers, going out for 2 or 3 mile warm up, easy, easy, easy. And then coming back to the track and doing, 15 to 20 minutes of dynamic stretches, drills, 2 by 100 meter strides and then maybe 2 by 50 meter strides. I get to do that in practice every week. It's a really nice way to warm up in those 100 meter strides, take the 50 meter strides a little bit faster, and then really listen to your body too. What do you need in this moment? What do you need that might be a little bit different from last week, especially if you are in a big, heavy training cycle or even an intense training cycle like a 5K? You might need a little bit more based on the day. And then ease into it. Maybe it is taking a transition interval first and then going into your first rep for your 5K workout. With racing, I love this question about racing and warming up because I feel like and know that the shorter the distance you're racing, the longer the warm up should be, right? So if you're going into a 1 mile and a 5K race, really focus in on maybe it's a 3 to 4 mile warm up. You're doing your dynamic stretches, your drills, your strides, and cooling or ending your last stride, taking a gel and hoping that there's about 5 to 7 minutes before the race starts. I know sometimes that can get a little funny depending on what race you're running and how big the race is, but it really does make a huge needle mover in your training and on race day. And I'm a big believer too that how you show up in training is how you show up on race day. So practicing this in training is going to give you, I think, a little bit of peace of mind and maybe some confidence that morning on race day, going into it, knowing you've done this before, you're going to do it again, and it's going to ease your concerns and have that breakthrough race.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this really gets to the point that like the harder the effort, the more comprehensive the warm up needs to be. And if you go to a college track meet, you are going to see people warming up in a very methodical way, and they're probably going to be doing strides almost up until the official calls them to the starting line. So their last stride might be 30 seconds or a minute before the race starts. And that just goes to show for those kinds of races where you're doing something very hard, whether it's a 5K or some workout on the track or a hill workout, as long as it's a high intensity workout, you need to be ready to start running at that intensity right from the gun, right from the first repetition. This is not maybe like a tempo run or a marathon pace effort where there's a little bit more flexibility to ease into the effort. If you're racing a mile, you need to be on your mile pace from step number one, right? And to be able to do that, to be metabolically primed for that effort, the warm up has to be pretty substantial. And I kind of look at it as like probably a 4-part warm up. You've got your dynamic warm up beforehand that sort of primes you for running. Then you've got some easy miles, usually 2 to 3 miles, maybe 4 is enough for most runners. Then you have a series of drills, then you do some strides, then you're ready to race or do your hard workout. Whereas, if you're getting ready for a marathon, maybe you just do the dynamic warm up, and you may even make it easier because you're not doing any of the lunges. So for example, the standard warm up routine that we have at strength running, this includes 50 different lunges. I don't think that's a good idea when you're lining up for a 26.2 mile race. It just might make you a little bit too sore. It's just a little bit too comprehensive. So this might be a good opportunity just to skip that entirely and just do 5 minutes of some relatively easy dynamic stretches. But this idea that longer and easier running just doesn't require as much of a warm-up is a pretty good one. And like you said, those Tuesday group runs that I join sometimes at Wash Park here in Denver, we won't really do much of a warm-up, and that's okay because it's a pretty low intensity, low effort kind of run, and my walk over to the group is probably enough for that warm-up.
Yeah.
Let's get into maybe my favorite question of this podcast, Sarah, which comes from Peter. He wants to know, how do you think about building an athlete over a multi-year period? Can you have any kind of a plan over that time horizon? This is a good one.
Yeah, I would say absolutely if the athlete knows where they want to go. If they know where they want to go, you take their ultimate goal. Let's say it's running a sub 3 hour marathon, it's a BQ, it's an OTQ, and you work backwards from there in terms of how long is it going to take us to get there. And sometimes you will have a lot of shifting in the planning too, right? You might have a breakthrough season. The athlete might adapt very quickly just to training in general and show really large gains over the first few years. But ultimately, you want to take that end goal, work backwards, and really make sure if it is, let's say, the marathon, that you're not just focused in on training for the marathon. You get to also work on speed and have different seasons that allow you to have and be a well-rounded athlete.
Yeah, it's a good question because it sort of is like a question about my entire life, right? Like for a very long time, my singular goal was to become the fastest runner I could be. And that was my multi-year goal. And the way that I did that was basically bouncing from season to season to season. And within each season, I had different goals. Maybe I was focused on a half marathon, or I was focused on a bunch of 5K, 8K, 10K distance races, or maybe it was a marathon cycle. And I think this idea of cycling through the training process is really important. And the one thing I'll say is if you do have, say, a 2 or 3 year goal, maybe it's that sub 3 marathon or that's Boston qualifying goal, I would say that doesn't mean that you have a 2 year training plan for a fast marathon. It means you have many cycles within that big time period. And each cycle is like a season. It might be a 12 to 20 week season, and you're focusing on something. It almost doesn't really matter what you're focusing on, whether it's a fast mile or a fast marathon or a fast half marathon. Really, what we're looking for is improvement. And so if I'm seeing improvement, then I'm going to be happy as a coach because after all, running fitness is running fitness, right? Like running is running. If you go from being able to run a 750 mile to a 722 mile, that's enormous improvement in my mind. And now you're a better runner. And better runners are also going to perform better in other race distances. So the best way to get better at some race distance is just to race a lot and get better at any race distance. And so, I mean, there's no one plan, right? Unless you have it. Sarah, do you have like a 3 year training program available?
No, I wish I did.
No, I don't.
Wish I could crack
Simple
that
answer.
code.
Yeah, there's really none. And, this is why I often chafe against some of these really long training cycles that some coaches write, this 24 or 28 week training plan. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is too long to really focus on much of anything. Maybe 24 weeks for a 100-mile ultra marathon. Maybe we can bend that rule a little bit, but I prefer the 12 to 18 week cycles and just focusing on executing more of those cycles during the year, because I think that's where the magic happens. That's where the improvement actually happens, is going after a bunch of different races, but then giving yourself enough rest and recovery in between those cycles so that you're fresh, you're still excited about your goals, and you can continue moving forward.
Absolutely. That rest and recovery is so important. And it's something that I think a lot of us as athletes don't like to lean into, but that really is the time and place for our mind and body to really recover, repair, and get ready and excited for the next training cycle.
Yeah, and I think the harder your training cycle, the more flexibility you have to rest even harder after that training cycle.
Yeah.
So, if it was just a 22-week high mileage, brutal marathon cycle, you might need 2 or 3 weeks off and then a whole bunch of very easy weeks afterward. But, if it was a 5K training cycle and you're not super beat up afterward and it was only 12 weeks, maybe you only need a week off and then you can sort of jump right back into things. I would say err on the conservative side, but probably recognize that you don't really need more than 3 to 5 weeks for most runners. All right, now let's get to endurance building. Well, also one of my favorite questions that we're going to tackle here. And this is for our high mileage runners. So Ivan wants to know, once your running volume gets high, let's say you're running more than 60 miles per week, can high volume cross training be used to expand your aerobic capacity even further? So, this is something, for example, where you might do a bunch of easy bike rides or even hikes. Is that something that's going to help your aerobic metabolism, or should we just focus on running because specificity is always king?
Ooh, this is a good question. I feel like, running is definitely the primary sport, right? So doing and running and practicing running as much as you can is a great way to set yourself up for success on race day. I think cross training does have its place, especially if an athlete is looking to maybe have doubles of running in the morning. You could do some biking or cycling at night. It is a way for some athletes who are maybe topping off at 3.5 hours in the long run, but the mileage is a little bit under that 20-mile threshold for, let's say, a marathon training cycle. It could be a really great idea for that athlete to jump on the bike and get another hour or so of aerobic fitness from that biking that lowers the risk of getting injured or being injured, but it still helps that athlete feel that they can conquer the 26.2 on race day. So I feel like it definitely has its place, but I would say from like the coaching standpoint, it's very like it depends per athlete and what makes sense for that athlete.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same boat where, actually, I think both things are true. Like specificity is king. You're
Mhm.
never going to become a good runner by cycling.
Yeah.
You're going to become a good runner by focusing on your running. That doesn't mean cross training doesn't have a place. And, if I have two runners in front of me with similar talent levels, one of them's running 65 miles a week with no cross training, and the other runner is doing 65 miles a week with an extra 3 hours of aerobic cross training, I'm going to slide my chips over to the runner who's doing the extra cross training
Mhm.
and place my money on that runner that they're probably going to win in the race. Just because when it comes to easy aerobic exercise, it's hard to say that more isn't better.
Mhm.
As long as you are doing appropriate training, and especially with cross training where the injury risk is so much less, as long as it's not negatively impacting your quality days, like maybe don't go for a 3 hour bike ride in the morning before your afternoon key quality session on the track because you're just going to be tired and you're not going to be able to perform very well. But if it's structured really well, I'm 100% for it. I would love to see high mileage runners also doing, the equivalent of high volume cross training because aerobic development is something that, is the gift that keeps on giving. And if we can continue to develop that aerobic metabolism, we're going to be better runners for it.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there any cross training that you don't like, Sarah, that you would just rather see runners avoid entirely?
Gosh, that's a great question. I love biking for runners. I love swimming for runners. Um, I think rowing has its place. And I would say sometimes hiking might not be considered cross training depending on how low the heart rate stays and where the zone lands and if it's really that beneficial for that athlete.
Yeah, hiking's an interesting one because like the way I think about it is it's probably more beneficial for ultra runners who actually
Mhm.
have to do some hiking within their events. And it's probably more helpful for trail runners who just likely have to, are obviously on that kind of terrain more often. So they're specifically getting exposure to that terrain. And for the ultra runners, they can practice speed hiking on uphills. They can practice, quickly descending on some technical terrain. There's a lot of different things they can focus on. It's just hard if those folks who are trying to get a lot of aerobic development with hiking, it's just hard if they don't live in a state like Colorado, like
Yeah.
we do, Sarah, because if you're not hiking uphill, maybe at altitude, it's probably going to be hard to get your heart rate up to a level that's going to have a
A
lot
lot
of
of
physiological
physiological.
benefit to your running. So while it can be great, it's also it kind of depends on how you structure it, like almost anything. I was a little surprised to hear you say swimming, by the way. Can you tell me how you like to incorporate swimming as cross training?
I think sometimes it can be an awesome, like if an athlete's running 5 days a week, they have 1 day of rest. Um, it can be an awesome sixth day, and it could be 30 minutes. I think aerobically, it's so solid for an athlete to be able to incorporate that into their training. Obviously, the injury risk is a lot lower. They have a lot of benefits that are added benefits to it from swimming and just staying in that low aerobic zone. But I have some athletes who can't run high mileage. So it is a way to kind of add in and sprinkle in some of that extra goodness.
Yeah, I see it as like likely the most therapeutic cross training that you might be able to choose. It's the cross training that's probably going to leave your body feeling the best afterward
Yeah.
because it's not super specific to running
Hmm.
and it's a little bit more recovery oriented. I think if runners can get comfortable in a low aerobic zone with swimming, they're going to be much more athletic in general, and so I do like to see that. Do you like to see runners do any pool running as well? Because it seems like you like the pool.
I actually don't like the pool.
Oh, you don't.
Well, personally, I don't like the pool. As a coach, I think it can be great. I think it all depends on the athlete. And I think pool running has its place if an athlete's coming back from injury. I feel like that's a really great place for an athlete to start. Or if they're coming back from an injury or stress fracture or somewhere where they need to be in a pool to be able to get that movement, have that aerobic development and build on that fitness, but not have the taxing of what a regular run can do for a body. So it definitely has its time and place, but I don't prescribe it for athletes who, are healthy. They're running great mileage, they're running healthy workouts, and everything's, going smoothly.
Yeah, I have some very bad memories of being injured a long time ago, and I immediately went from all of my running outside to all of my running plus about 50% in the pool. So
Yeah.
I was running about 2 hours in the pool every day, split between two workouts, usually an hour, or maybe 90 minutes and a half an hour. And not only did I just smell like chlorine all day, every day, but it was the most boring training block of my entire life, and I would
Yeah.
not wish that upon anyone. I know there are a lot of people love pool running. They get the aqua jogging belt on and they can just
Oh.
spend hours in the pool. It is maybe the most boring exercise, but it is more specific. And so if you are injured, it can be a really good training tool for you. Now, speaking of specificity, Joseph has a really good question, sort of about the difference between being in shape and the difference between being race ready. And I think they are somewhat mutually exclusive. Like you can be in good shape, but not be ready to race. And so Joseph says, coming out of a big racing block, there is a detraining phase. You might not run any hard workouts, but you're still running some decent mileage in the weeks after a goal race. How should we think about fitness and where we are as we then build into the next training block, which is a few months down the road? Should we do a time trial to see where we're at, or should we just sort of accept how we feel and how we're performing at this time of the training phase?
That's a great question. And I feel like a lot of athletes might ask this question after they come off of a training cycle, they come off of a great race. And I would say, trust the process. Let's get back to running. Let's get back to running some good mileage, start adding in the strides, the hill strides, get that long run back to where it needs to be. And let's just see where you are. I don't think a time trial is really necessary, especially if this athlete has just raced 6 weeks ago or something. We have a great data point from that race, and we can use that to structure the future training cycle or the next training cycle. And then, of course, like shift things around a little bit as we need to based on how that athlete is showing up, because we show up differently every single day. And that's one of the coolest parts of being a runner and being an athlete. And it's something that when you have a coach, the coaches are able to also shift and move things around to set that athlete up for success. So I would say, lean into it, trust the process, and have a lot of fun rebuilding.
Yeah, and this whole idea of rebuilding, I use that term all the time anyway. But let's be clear, it's not like this person is rebuilding from scratch, right? Like
Yeah.
every cycle builds on itself. And the difference between being race ready and being in good shape is a stark difference.
Yeah.
And it sort of just depends on where you are in the training cycle. And I know earlier we talked about this idea of just cycling through the training process. And you just said, believe in the process, trust the process. Part of that process is taking time off after a goal race, then having a period of easy training where you're probably not doing a lot of workouts. The workouts you are doing are probably short or low intensity, or maybe a combination. And then you get into the competition phase of training where you start doing hard workouts. Then you might start adding in some tune-up races. Then you're sort of in your peak training. Then you start tapering. Then you run your goal race, and the whole cycle repeats itself. And if we were to insert a time trial into that early phase of training where we're just doing low intensity running, it's almost like we're sort of disrespecting the training cycle and where we are within that cycle. So I would say to Joseph, you are still in great shape. You're just not going to race well because you're not really primed for a peak performance. But your foundation is still there. You have already built this amazing base or foundation of fitness. You're just not really ready to run very fast. So respect that process and just commit to whatever your coach is telling you to do or whatever the training cycle that you've created is indicating. So if it's just easy running and building back both your mileage and your workouts, let's do that. Let's not try to add a whole bunch of things during this, essentially base phase of training, because it's not really the time for that. We'll get to that later when we're doing the hard workouts and our body is much more primed to actually run fast. Wow, what a whirlwind, Sarah. We got through all of our questions for today. Is there anything on any of those questions that we didn't really get to that you wanted to highlight for our listeners today? And let me first just say thank you to everyone who submitted their questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the questions. It was awesome. And I feel like if you're going into a new training cycle, if you have a race coming up, maybe you're in taper phase right now, like just know that you can do it. Know that you've put in all the hard work. Trust yourself, prove yourself right with every mile, and it's going to be an awesome experience. And then you get to rest, recover, and do everything all over again.
I love it. And, since we are talking about progression and some of these big picture things about training cycles and multi-year goals and things like that, I think a big principle to maybe leave our listeners with is this idea of progressive overload. And it has to happen both within a cycle and also from cycle to cycle. So, for example, Sarah, you're training really well right now. You're hoping to have a fantastic half marathon tomorrow. We saw each other, I want to say roughly a month ago, a couple weeks ago, we were running, and you were saying you were running over 70 miles a week.
Yeah.
You didn't always run 70 miles a week. This training cycle that you're currently in is a huge level up from training cycles that you might have accomplished
Mhm.
1 or even 2 years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm training for my sixth marathon, and each training cycle builds on the last training cycle, right? And I've sprinkled in a lot of half marathons, like I'm running and racing a half marathon tomorrow. I'm racing a marathon in 5 weeks. And I've sprinkled in speed. I've raced some 5Ks, some 10Ks. I'm going back to that after running CIM. I think that's going to be a huge up level to my training. And each training cycle really does build on the last one. So I ran Boston earlier this year. We touched 73 miles. I had a lot of hilly long runs. We added in strength. For this training cycle, we really focused in on let's run a little bit more higher mileage. Let's have some awesome tune-ups. I ran a 5K race 3 weeks ago in Chicago. I have the Indianapolis half tomorrow, and then CIM for the last build. And So there's a lot of quality, there's a lot of high mileage. I'm still practicing my strength training and getting into the gym. And really, my mindset has shifted a lot in this training cycle specifically. So I have a much stronger mind going into these races, into the high mileage weeks, and it's a great place to be. But know that when you do see someone running, maybe as much as I am, know that it does take a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice, and you're inching forward. If you take big jumps, typically you'll see an injury or something happen. It could be burnout from the athlete. So if you inch forward and just change, maybe it's one, maybe two things in your training cycle each time, at some point you'll get to where you want to be. Maybe it is running high mileage. Maybe it is running that 70, 75 miles a week. But really trust yourself and know that you'll get there. And it's just a matter of time. Time's going to pass anyways. So we might as well train and do what we can, and eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, I like how your progress has included progress in a lot of different areas. You've gotten more consistent with strength training over time. So you've progressed with your strength training. You have progressed with your overall weekly mileage. You've probably progressed with how you approach tune-up races, probably for your first marathon. Maybe you didn't run a tune-up race because you're so focused on the training, or you just did one tune-up race, and now you're just racing all the time because you can just get after it, right?
Yeah. In my first training cycle, I ran like 5 races in that training cycle, and I didn't know what I was doing. This was a long time ago. So I just registered for all these races, and then it ended up being just a lot of intense, like, race weekends, right? But yeah, each training cycle, I learned so much about myself, and it's something that I really hope that everyone, once they get through a training cycle, you run your A goal race, take some time to really reflect on what worked, what didn't work in the training cycle, what you can up level for the next training cycle. And it could be in nutrition, it could be in sleep, it could be this summer I added in heat training, and my coach asked me to start running, around 10, 11 a.m. or even in the afternoon if I could fit that into my schedule. And that's a huge game changer too. So I really suggest like leaning into the uncomfortable parts maybe that you don't want to really explore in training, because that's where you're going to find the most growth. That'll lead to maybe some fun race times.
Well, I'm excited. Well, Sarah, best of luck tomorrow. I hope you accomplish your goal and it's everything you hoped it would be. If folks want to connect with you somewhere on the internets, where might they be able to find you?
Yeah, I am on Instagram at Sarah, Sayrah runs happy, and at Elevate Your Running. My coaching website is elevateyourrunning.com, and you can find me in both of those places.
There we go. Well, Sarah, thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.